Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Lumsden McCormick Annual Exempt Organizations Conference. My name is Christine Prue, and I am going to serve as the host for your webinar this morning. Before we get started with introductions, I'm going to run through a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded, and once it's available, we will share a link with all attendees. Both the chat and Q&A are enabled. You can type in comments into the chat, and if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A for the panelists and host. We will be answering questions throughout the webinar, so we encourage you to ask questions. We're offering 1 hour of CPE credit for this webinar. Therefore, all polling and survey questions need to be answered. We will have 4 polling questions during the presentation, and you'll be prompted for each, and the results will be shared. At the end of the webinar, please complete the short survey, which will automatically launch. The survey will serve as the webinar evaluation and is required for those of you requesting CPE credit. A CPE CPE certificate will be emailed to everyone who requested it no later than December 21st. Questions on CPE credits can be emailed to Maria, and I will put her email in the chat shortly. A link to the slide deck will be provided in the follow-up email for those presentations that are permitted to be shared. Now I'd like to hand things over to our moderator for today, Seth Hennard. Seth is an audit principal specializing in governmental entities, including school districts, public authorities, and municipalities, as well as healthcare institutions. Seth, you can take it away.
Welcome, everybody. So we're happy to have our annual Exempt conference as a virtual event this year. Here today with us is Kathleen Martino. In 2016, Kathleen became a reservist in the public assistance for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, in a variety of roles and growing responsibilities. She left FEMA in 2020 and began working with Tidal Basin, where she's responsible for assisting over 60 Western New York applicants with more than 40 grant applications and approximately $50 million in COVID-19 reimbursements for schools, hospitals, towns, and villages. And so with that, turn it over to Kathleen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I want to thank Lumsden McCormick for inviting me. And I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And this was from a little joke that we used to tell at FEMA, because sometimes that can be a little scary, but I'm trying to take, with this presentation, take that out of it, the fear, the unknown, and empower you with some tools that should help you for COVID-19 applications if you're applying, or any other type of disaster, snowstorms, ice storms, whatever. So I also want to just briefly say that this is my presentation. This is not FEMA's or New York State's or Tidal Basin's. I've put it together myself based on my FEMA experience, my experience with this COVID-19 for New York State, and also from the resources that are available to all of us, FEMA.gov and New York State Recover. So to begin with, one of the things is the FEMA and state relationship. I think there's some confusion about that, and also definition of some terms that might help you if you are applying for grant relief. Okay, so there's an event that happens. For example, COVID-19 is an event. When an event like that happens, and it reaches a certain dollar threshold in the state requests FEMA to come in, do an assessment, and approve them for a declaration of a disaster. So the event becomes a disaster. And these normally, for example, for snowstorms, ice storms, hurricanes, the declared areas in that state are not generally the entire state. It's generally localized counties, cities, towns, certain areas. For COVID-19, unfortunately, every county in the state of New York is a declared disaster area. So entities within those counties are eligible for applying for relief. And I'll get into that in just a second. And Another term that you'll hear a lot is recipient. So the recipient is the state, or it could be, if it's a tribal government applying, that would be the recipient. The recipient is the entity that FEMA will be sending the dollars to. And that entity, that recipient, has subrecipients, also known as applicants. And the people applying, the villages, towns, schools, hospitals, those small entities are subrecipients of the larger recipient, in this case, New York State. So again, towns and villages, subrecipient and applicant, those terms are used interchangeably. And, but we'll be using applicant primarily to describe the first level applicant, applicant to the grant process, to the state. So, okay, hold on one second. Okay, so then the next process, Seth, you want to go to the next slide? There's a question here. Are you attending this webinar for CPE credit? Okay, just let me know when we can proceed to the next one.
Great, we've closed out polling for that. Seth, you can move on.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so again, FEMA and the state, the definition of the terms. FEMA is the grantor. They're invited by the state, who then is the recipient of the FEMA grant process. The state manages it along with FEMA. There are people assigned by the state and by FEMA to work with the applicant subrecipients and get them through this grant process to recover dollars that were lost due to the event or disaster. In the COVID case, a lot of those claims are PPE, disinfectant, things like that. So the state works with FEMA, and the state also works with the applicant. They're sort of in the middle. And so it's very important to understand everybody's role, and I'm kind of going over it briefly, but there are resources that I can direct you to at the end of this that can give you some more information. So if we'll go to the next slide. Applicants, once a disaster has happened and it has been deemed, your area is deemed eligible for FEMA aid, you go to the state actually and do a formal request for public assistance. And public assistance, it sounds kind of funny because you would think public assistance would be for the individuals, but it's actually the public entities such as cities, towns, villages, hospitals, PNPs, private nonprofits, that are eligible for public assistance. IA in FEMA is individual assistance, and that's for the actual people who have been affected by disasters. They get, there's all types of programs under that. But specifically what we're going to deal with here is public assistance. That's my specialty. So the applicants either go online to New York State, they can go onto the FEMA website, and they find the request for assistance form. Also, I want to mention too, after a disaster, especially now with COVID-19 being so widespread, the states are actually reaching out to potential applicants. So currently for COVID-19, this request for public assistance is not closed. It's still open. So even if you haven't applied yet and you think you may have eligible expenses, you could still reach out to the state or FEMA and request public assistance. In other disasters, in hurricanes, or I'll even use, for example, for Western New York, the Halloween storm that you had in 2019. That was October 31st through November 1st. So the event started October 31st and it ended November 1st. And there was a time period, usually 30 days, for an applicant to request public assistance based on something that happened to them during that event, during that storm. For COVID-19, it's a little different. The event actually started January 20th At this point, there is no end date, and FEMA is still accepting requests for public assistance, FEMA and the state. They work together. The state looks at the requests, the documentation provided by the applicant. If it's satisfactory to the state, they give it to FEMA. FEMA again reviews it, and then they deem the applicant either eligible for assistance or ineligible. And also, at any time during the process, we use these terms eligible and ineligible. If there's something is ineligible, there is an appeal mechanism to have the state or FEMA revisit why you were deemed ineligible, whether it's as an applicant or your claim specifically. And we'll get into that in more detail. Okay, so I guess I'll just at this point see if there's any questions, if that's okay. I want to make sure he's following.
No questions yet, but if anybody has any questions, use the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll ask Kathleen questions as we go.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so when you have been approved for a request for public assistance, you are then given access to the tools such as Grants Portal, which is a FEMA program. And we'll get into that again a little bit more. But you are also assigned a state representative. For COVID-19, I would be one of them. And you are also assigned a FEMA Program Delivery Manager, or PDMG. And that's something that FEMA assigns. So you actually have a state and FEMA person working with you to get your damages cataloged into the system and hopefully reimbursed. Okay. Next slide, please. Oh, polling question. This is a good one. Okay, great. Yes, no, okay. I see the results. A significant amount have not had a FEMA experience, and that's understandable. In New York State, we're actually very lucky. We have very few disasters. Places like Florida, Texas, California, where I have worked, they see them regularly, and I'm sure you all see them on the news, and they are very good at this process. And I've actually learned a lot from that process, watching them implement things. So I'm going to share some of what I've learned with them as well with you, because unfortunately, this is probably not the last pandemic. And that's not just me saying that, that is the federal government has been saying it for many years, actually. And so again, it's better to be prepared and not need it than to be trying to work your way through it, especially because things are changing so fast. So I'm going to give you some tips and tools on how to do that. And if you'll just go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about eligible activities. So things that may be eligible in a disaster in general. Your labor, in particular, having to deal with the effects either before an event happens, you know something's coming, you know a snowstorm's coming, you start salting the roads, you start making preparations, and there's labor involved in that. And again, I'm going to give you just kind of a brief overview. There are specifics to eligible activities that you need to be aware of, but this is all public information. It's at the FEMA website, fema.gov. /emergency. And the document I would recommend is the, we call it the Papa G at FEMA. It is the Public Assistance Guide. And FEMA updates it regularly, but it covers every type of category of work, which FEMA categorizes work done to recover from A to G. And currently for COVID, it's only category B, which is emergency protective measures. Category A is another big one usually in disasters, which is debris removal. Obviously for COVID, there's not a need for that, but definitely the category B is probably one. If you don't use it in the COVID disaster, you probably will use it in snowstorms or ice storms or things like that. And that's an emergency protective measure to protect the public health and safety from an imminent threat. And it's also preparation as well as post-disaster events. And there's a period of time, and I'm not going to get into all of the time because we're a little limited here, but I just want to kind of give you the overview of that. The eligible activities that can be in a disaster, again, labor, your workforce, or if you've had to contract it out, any equipment that you might have used. Again, in normal disasters, that could be backhoes, bulldozers, trucks, different things like that. I'm saying helicopters. FEMA has a whole equipment list if you ever want an interesting tour of what FEMA looks at as eligible equipment. Pull up their equipment rate. Unfortunately, COVID-19, nothing for COVID-19 was on their equipment rates. So ventilators, hospital beds, and things like that are having to be categorized a little bit differently. But generally in an event, in a disaster, you have equipment you should be aware of that you can claim. Materials and supplies is probably the most common. It is, for COVID-19, as I said, your masks, your disinfectants, your gloves, your actually used materials. That is not equipment. I guess equipment would be something a little bit more fixed that you would have an hourly rate with or an operator. Materials and supplies are things that you purchase and use and discard. That's probably the easiest way to kind of separate those two out. And again, contracts, if you've contracted with an agency to assist you in the recovery, those contracts could be eligible for reimbursement to some degree. And administrative costs, and this is a good one to remember as well, because when you're putting all these eligible projects together for FEMA, you should be tracking your time, photocopying, gathering receipts, talking to FEMA and state personnel, those meetings that you'll have. Those are all eligible for reimbursement at the very end. And I'll say at the very end, when all of your projects are submitted, there is a mechanism for submitting those administrative costs that you incurred, the time and expense, and get some form of reimbursement for that. Okay, so do we have any other questions at this point, or do we going to just keep moving on?
A couple of questions.
Sure.
One of them I think you might have just answered, but one question we had for a past slide was just to clarify that nonprofits are eligible for the assistance, and if it's a different process to apply for the assistance if it's a nonprofit versus a government.
Okay, good question. Nonprofits are eligible. There is specific eligibility that I would refer to you again to FEMA website for more information, or the state, but we call them private nonprofits, such as in some cases, houses of worships are eligible. If they have facilities that are not used for worship, they're used open for the public. And I guess the best way to think of this is you're offering services to the public at large. So it's not restricted to a single group. And that's what makes a nonprofit eligible, or may make them eligible. Again, it's a public service that they offer. It's not just for an individual group. So again, houses of worship were an issue for a while. If a house of worship has a classroom that they offer to the public to use, then if that classroom is damaged in an event, that may be eligible for reimbursement. So that's kind of how to think of that. And did that answer the question sufficiently?
I think so.
Okay.
We just got a question from Kathleen in the chat. Says our local rep has indicated that internal labor and overtime are not eligible for COVID reimbursement.
Okay, so again, with COVID, it's a little different. I'm kind of just giving you the overview of any disaster. We can get more specific into COVID, and if you would like more information, I can certainly supply that to you. FEMA also has fact sheets on COVID-19 eligibility specifically. Again, this is kind of just an overview of all the events that could happen, with touching on a little bit of the difference in COVID. So yes, you're right. Labor is an issue with COVID-19. Materials and supplies is a little bit broader category for COVID-19. There's more materials and supplies than labor or equipment.
Great, thanks. And then another question came in, again, specific to COVID-19. It came in before you asked or answered about the equipment. So again, about talking to the local rep, I think you mentioned that COVID-19 doesn't have any equipment reimbursement. So they were asking about any kind of like industrial cleaning type equipment that was purchased specifically because of COVID is still not eligible, it sounds like.
Okay, well, I just want to clarify that a little bit. When I was talking about COVID-19 not being on the equipment list, I was actually speaking about the equipment rate sheet that FEMA uses to determine how much of the equipment used is eligible for reimbursement. They didn't have anything like that for COVID-19 at this point. So it's kind of, you're putting everything under maybe materials and supplies. And I know that sounds crazy, but again, if you're using industrial cleaning equipment, you may, if you put that under equipment, FEMA's going to ask you who used it, how many hours they used it, and work closely with your local rep to determine which is the best way. In my opinion, I would say put it under materials and supplies, but again, your local rep and also your FEMA PDMG can guide you a little bit better. Everybody's circumstance is a little bit different, even though it's the same event. And again, I'm just trying to give you an overview, but definitely work with your rep. If they say put it on the equipment form, then by all means, if that's applicable, then go ahead. And I think that should answer the question. I hope.
So we got something that just came in. So it says submitting for questionable items are said to actually hold up the reimbursement process, from what she is told.
Right. Okay. That goes into a little bit more of the claims and projects. I'll just touch on it briefly here because this has been a big issue. Initially, the event, in the early days, March, April, May, we were still getting guidance from FEMA. Now that it's gone on a little bit longer, FEMA has shored up their eligibility definitions. They've received projects and they're responding to what they're seeing in the field. So some of those responses, for example, there's costs for daycare. FEMA has said are not eligible. And applicants still want to put it in. I've been recommending that any cost that may be questionable should be in a separate project. Because yes, when that one item is looked at by the reviewer and they say, nope, I think that's an ineligible item, it goes through a whole internal FEMA review process. And because there are so many now in the pipeline, it's really delaying projects. So everything else on your project might be eligible, your PPE, your masks. And if you have that one item in there, like a daycare cost that isn't eligible, everything stops until that determination is made if it's eligible or not, because FEMA has to give you the law as well as the reasoning behind making that item ineligible, because you have the right to appeal it. So again, it takes the project, sets it aside until that process is complete, that determination memo process is called, until that's completed. So I recommend to my applicants, if there's something questionable, little gray area, do it as a separate application. Let's get all the ones that we know are eligible in one application and get it through as quickly as possible. Does that help? Did that help?
I think that makes sense. And I think we're all caught up on the question, so we can move on. And then if more questions come up, I can let you know.
Great, thank you. Okay, next slide. Okay, application essentials. Again, across all disasters, there are basic documents that you will provide. When you first do your request for public assistance, you will provide documents that show how your entity was created, tax ID information. There's a whole packet of information that you'll provide that FEMA and the state will look at to determine your eligibility. Okay. Then when you're doing the project, you're putting in your claim, you need to show FEMA that you have policies in place that address those costs. So for example, let's talk about procurement. Procurement is purchasing. So you had to go and purchase items in an emergency. It's procurement is looked at not as not as narrow a focus in an emergency category of work as opposed to another category. So just covering category B emergency work, how you purchased something, you followed your own policies that you have in place at the time of the event. So FEMA will want to see your procurement policy. And again, before you need it, this is probably a good time to look at these items, procurement, your procurement policy. If you don't have one, you may want to implement one. Because seeing what's happening now, there may be a time when you need to apply for assistance to FEMA and the state. So you'll need to show that you had procurement clauses, how things are bid, how they're purchased. If there's thresholds that you have in there, like over a certain dollar amount, they need some additional approvals. FEMA will want to see that you followed your own policies first. In those procurement policies as well, they'll want to see that you followed the state and federal procurement guidelines. And again, these are available on FEMA's and New York State's websites. And I can also provide you with some other additional information if you need it, or your current representative should have it as well. Procurement clauses drafted to help applicants create their own procurement policies. So when you do submit for a claim, it's in there and it's complete. It's the reviewer can see that you followed your own internal as well as state and federal policies. And if an event happens and you don't have a procurement policy, that could be an issue, and that's something that can be addressed separately. But just overall, since most of you haven't had the FEMA experience, you'll definitely either want a procurement policy or you want to at least review your current one, make sure that it's up to the state and federal current standards. And I'll get into this a little bit, in an emergency, you'll have an emergency clause in there. If an emergency happens, this is what we do for purchasing. And it's just a tip, don't include if eligible by FEMA in any of the language. You don't want to make it that as long as FEMA's covering it, you can buy it. That's not how this works. You have to be buying these items anyway. And if it's an eligible FEMA expense, great. And if it's not, and you still need to buy it, then you still need to do it and move forward. Okay, so I think that's enough about procurement, but procurement is very important. Again, labor policies, if you are claiming some type of labor, there's rules about regular time versus overtime for FEMA and the type of category work. Again, we're talking about category B, an emergency protective measure. So you might have had to contract labor for, let's say, maintenance, additional disinfecting, or maybe your current labor force has to do additional maintenance, overtime. That could be eligible, but those labor practices should be in your labor policy that you'll show FEMA and the state as well. And I don't mean to just leave out the state, because the state also reviews these things as well. But they'll want to see that in your policy, you have overtime, how overtime is calculated, fringe benefits, all of these things come into the cost of the labor that you're claiming. So again, review your labor policies. consider emergency circumstances and whether you need to shore those up. And then insurance policies, FEMA is a payer of last resort. So if something is eligible to be claimed under your insurance policy, FEMA would want you to do that first. Under normal disaster circumstances, hurricanes, floods, things like that, there sometimes are insurance coverages. There may be high deductibles, which is a different issue that FEMA may cover the deductible. But again, it's only for eligible expenses, but the FEMA does want to see your insurance policies, even for COVID-19, even though there's no insurance coverage for a pandemic per se, or certainly none that I've seen. FEMA just wants to see, and I mean your entire binder, not just the declaration page. So you'd probably go to your insurance agent and have them give you a digital copy of your entire binder. And you would upload that as well as these other policies to the grants portal, your communication with FEMA, so that those are in place and they will cover all of your projects. So you'll just upload them once, and then as many projects as you submit, those will be used for reference, unless they expire, or FEMA asks you to update them. But they would ask you for that information. Okay. Any other questions at this point?
There's a follow-up question to your last answer, another one's about setting up a separate project for questionable costs.
Mm-hmm.
Question is there a minimum project cost to kind of set up that separate questionable project?
Good question. Yes, thank you very much for that. Yes, there is a minimum threshold. Currently, it's $3,300. So you'd have to have a project that has eligible expenses of $3,300 minimum.
Thanks. And then the next one is a polling question.
Mm-hmm. No. Oh, wow. Almost 50-50. Okay. That's interesting. I've heard some very interesting stories about links people went to purchase personal protective equipment, mostly face masks, going to funeral homes, vets, dentists. People got very creative. I will say this. Okay. So if we can move on to the next, the claim documentation. This one trips up a lot of people because depending on the eligible activity, which I had spoke about earlier, labor, equipment, materials and supplies, contracts, administrative costs. The documentation is a little different in each scenario. And again, this is all covered in depth in the FEMA Papa G, also on the state websites. Even for New York State, they came out with a COVID handbook and other facts, but I'll just give you an overview of the claim documentation. First of all, it should be in the event period. So for COVID, again, the event period began January 20th. Many of you didn't suffer any losses possibly until March. However, if you had items in stock from January 20th forward and you use those stock items for COVID-related reasons, for example, you had disinfectant in the storeroom and you had it, normally it would last you 3 months, but you went through it within a month. That could be an eligible item. For that, you would need to provide the invoice from when you purchased it and some type of record of how it was used, an activity log. Usually that's sufficient. Again, if you've used up all the stock in a month and it was a 3-month stock supply, and you had to obviously reorder. So your reorder then also would be eligible. And again, you would provide the invoice, purchase order, the proof of payment. FEMA will ask you, if you took it from stock or if it was purchased, they will ask you when you used it. And I know it's kind of hard to say, yeah, well, I use it all on, March 2nd. Well, I use it throughout the month of March would probably be more of an appropriate answer. So you try to take the information is sort of for broad disasters, and we're trying to kind of focus it a little bit more into the COVID related expense that you're experiencing and your documentation to explain what you did and why you did it. And I'll get into that a little bit more after. But again, the claim documentation, invoices, proof of purchase, activity logs for labor, again, the equipment rate that I spoke about earlier, who used your equipment, how long it was used for, will all need to be documented. And of course, the costs need to be directly related to the event specifically. So if you bought something that you used, using another disaster, I'll use the Halloween storm. So you got ready for the storm and you had to go out maybe and buy clippers and things like that for, clearing debris and trees and things like that. Okay, those may be eligible under the equipment, and you would have to show that you used them within that October 31st, November 1st event timeline. You could have used them after that, but they had to have been purchased for that time period. It's kind of hard to give examples just off the cuff because you have to really see the eligible item specifically and then shore up your claim with their documentation. I guess I can give you general, for example, an insurance claim. If anybody's ever had a car accident or you have homeowners insurance, something happened at your house, the agents and adjusters come in, they look at the damages, they assess it, they say it's worth X amount, and then they ask you, tell them you think it's worth this, and this is why. Here's your documentation showing that you are legally responsible for the car or the home. You show them the cost to put your car or home back to the way it was, and you ask your insurance company to make those repairs, to give you the money to make those repairs. Very similar in FEMA with claim documentation. You're showing them you spent the money, it was an eligible expense, and this is what you need reimbursement for. And keep in mind one thing too with reimbursement from FEMA, is generally a 75%, 25% split. So FEMA will give the state the money, the state will give you 75%, they have another 25%, and they can give that out in different ways. There's ways of getting that other 25%. Sometimes it goes up to even higher percentages where FEMA will actually pay 90% and the state would be responsible for the 10. But again, the accuracy and the completeness of your documentation helps you tremendously in making those claims for the dollars and calculating things and making sure that you're getting at least as much back as you possibly can from FEMA and the state. Any questions at this point?
No questions at this point. And I'll just give you like a 8-minute warning.
Okay, I'll try to step it up a little bit. My next slide, grants portal. So in the old days with disasters, and I mean the old days, FEMA started in 1979 Jimmy Carter signed it into the agency into existence to handle disasters nationwide. And initially it was done through paper and pen. You'd have a FEMA representative and a state representative come out and work with you and write it all down, take the pictures, and submit the project for you. FEMA has moved now to more of a technological where they have instituted this grants portal program for applicants to basically do a lot of the things that the FEMA personnel and state personnel used to do for you. And it gives you more control of uploading your documentation, creating projects and working on them before submitting them, filling out the questions, uploading your documentation, making sure your calculations are correct, having them reviewed by your state and FEMA personnel for accuracy. And then even once the project is submitted, you can still follow it through the system, through the review system at FEMA and at the state level, all through Grants Portal. It provides forms as well. There's a resources section under support that has online application PDFs and webinars. They've started adding webinars, live webinars where you can go online and ask questions. They'll show you how to do the projects, the applications. And they also take these presentations and you can save them and share them with your teams. And so Grants Portal has been a tremendous boon in transparency for the applicants and having tremendously more control over how projects are submitted, what's submitted, like that. So I think it's terrific. It's only getting better. I know there's some things in it that can be improved, like everything, but from where it started in 2016, I think it's phenomenal. And I highly recommend, if you don't have access to it now, you may want to reach out to somebody you know who does. You can take a look at it with them. But it's a good thing to know about, because once you are approved for public assistance, you are granted access to this. And again, it's a tremendous resource for forms. The online application for COVID-19 is something new that FEMA did in Grants Portal, which basically allows you to do your application on your screen. Whereas again, in the past, we had to do it, paper or spreadsheets. And one thing I do want to say about spreadsheets too, they're very important. FEMA has forms for those, but you can also use your own, but they should be as complete as if it was a FEMA spreadsheet. And again, your state representatives, your FEMA representatives have templates and information that can help you that, but know to ask. And also know that when you're putting your costs together, you can do your own spreadsheet and you may want some guidance on how to clarify it a little bit, but you can use your own Excel spreadsheet. And I recommend it tremendously. It's a tremendous help. And these again are all uploaded documentations into Grants Portal. All the documents that I talked about so far. This is your resource, Grants Portal, for everything. Okay. Also, one thing too about Grants Portal, it'll kind of follow you for life. So for example, if you had a claim for the Halloween storm, 4472, and now you have a COVID-19 claim, 4480 is the disaster. You'll see both of those disasters under your applicant profile in Grants Portal. So you'll always be able to reference what you've put into the system for any disaster once you're in there. And I know there's another disaster, I think it's 4567. It was a Hurricane Isaias. I don't know if I'm saying that right, that happened this year in New York. So there's another new disaster even after COVID. But again, if you applied for any of those benefits or you're in Grants Portal for any of that, you'll see it in there and you can track what you did in the past and what you're doing now. It's like a one-stop archive. Think of it that way. Okay, any questions at this point?
No questions. And then we're on to the next polling question. Have you ever received a grant from FEMA from COVID?
I think I know the answer to this. No. Oh, wow. Some few of you have, huh? Oh, very good. Okay. I'm not surprised that the majority haven't received payments from COVID. It's just starting to trickle out now. It's again been a very unique process because FEMA's kind of had to revamp a few things internally to, meet the need. But money is starting to flow. So I'm glad to hear that some of you have. And to the others, just stay in there, track your projects. There's ways you can subscribe to your projects in grants portal. So when something is done, you're notified automatically that something's been done in your project. And again, these things we can address separately. You're all welcome. You can contact me, send me emails if you have further questions, or you need some guidance, who to contact for a request for public assistance. I've been more than happy to help you. And then the next slide. I know
We have a couple
low on time.
A couple of quick questions.
Sure.
Are the funds paid by check, or how is that received?
Oh, okay. Good question. Actually, it's done electronically primarily. FEMA sends the money to the state, and then the state has internally its own recovery website that issues you the funds. You can draw down the funds. It's called a drawdown. I'll be honest with you, I'm not that familiar with New York State's. I've only looked at it a little bit and seen a little bit of some training on it. I haven't had the experience myself, so I don't really want to speak to something I haven't experienced personally. But it is a mechanism that the state has, and the state will reach out to you when those funds are available. So you don't have to worry about, did I miss something? Definitely the state will reach out to you and to disperse those funds to you.
Thanks. And the other question is just, is there any specific resources for school districts in determining eligibility for FEMA assistance?
Actually, there is a fact sheet that did come out in September 1st, a memo from FEMA. It's also on FEMA's website. If you look COVID-19, and if you go to FEMA's website and type in COVID-19 school costs eligibility or eligible costs, you'll see the September 1st memo that FEMA put out. And it does address schools as well as hospitals. And I'll just say, and I don't want to get into too much of it, the eligibility has narrowed from the beginning. So that's why FEMA did come out with that memo. And if whoever's asking the question would like a copy of that memo, let me know. I can send it to you as well.
Thanks.
Okay.
A couple of questions.
Is that it for now? I want to just get to the narratives. This narratives part is extremely important. You'll see throughout the FEMA process, they ask you for a description of activities or a scope of work. And many times either people give too much irrelevant information or not enough relevant information. And I like to call this the who, what, where, when, why, and how. So your narrative, your description of activities or scope of work should describe who you are as an entity and what you did in for example, COVID to respond. So I'll give you an example for schools. FEMA wants to know how many people, how many students you have, how many buildings, how many staff and faculty. When did you close? Because we know in New York State, the state mandated the schools closed in March. So if the schools closed in March, what did you do after that? That, for example, you needed to continue to purchase disinfectant and masks. And I know in many cases with schools, your buildings were still being used by faculty and staff, just not students. So your narrative would describe, we are school district XYZ, we have 1,500 students over 3 campuses and 200 faculty and staff. In March 13th, 2020, New York State mandated we close the schools to students in classroom. However, we continue to use the buildings and the campuses for faculty and staff to do remote learning. Therefore, we needed to continue to disinfect and have masks for faculty and staff. So I've just described who you were and what you did in response to COVID, that you needed to incur those costs. And that is very important. They shouldn't be short narratives. They shouldn't be quick little blurbs, and they should be relevant to the project. So if you're a school district and you're putting in for disinfectant and PPE, but maybe you also want to do a daycare, well, then you should do a project for the disinfectant and masks. And then if you want to do a project for the daycare, then their narrative would describe what you did for the daycare. You're a school district XYZ with students in your district that were that had parents who were essential workers. The state mandated you provide childcare for these essential workers, and you contracted with YMCA to provide this. So that would be specific to that project, that narrative. The other narrative I gave you is more specific to the disinfectant and mask wearing after the school was closed. Because again, reviewers are looking at this going, okay, well, if the school closed, why do they still need masks? So you need to kind of think in your mind, if I was reading this and somebody was asking me to write a check for it, what would I want to know? I think that's a good measure. So you're giving the reviewer something to understand what they're looking at. Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay.
No real questions. I think earlier you said if people want to reach out to you, that's possible to have questions.
Yes, absolutely.
Contact information.
Is it in the materials, or do you need me to provide it?
Is it on the first slide? No.
I just dropped our conference speaker bios in the chat, so everybody can find that link there.
Great.
And once you close out of the session, the chat will not be available, but they are still available on our website. If you go to the Exempt conference, you will see it there. We will also attach them in the final email that we send out next week to people.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just want to conclude with something I think is extremely important, and even FEMA thinks it's important because they're providing resources for it. Being prepared in advance. You may never have a need for doing a FEMA claim, but I recommend everybody prepare emergency manuals, emergency operations policies and procedures that cover everything that you could have, such as snowstorms, ice storms, floods, and include pandemics in your planning. And FEMA has resources on their website for comprehensive planning. And I would want you to check with FEMA on this, but I do believe that they do have some type of updates that you can be apprised of for their formats for planning. They have comprehensive planning guides and information, and they constantly update it. And I know they're in an update right now if you go to their website, but please get an emergency plan together. Make sure that your policies and procedures are updated to include things like pandemics as well. So in the future, hopefully we never need it, but if you do, you are your own best advocate. You should be able to drive the process with the assistance of the state and FEMA instead of the other way around. With the tools like Grants Portal and everything that it does, it's becoming more and more that the applicants are really driving a lot of the process, and should, because it's your money. You're entitled to receive it, and you should be able to present your claim and be reimbursed and be made at least back to pre-disaster conditions, as FEMA would say. So I hope you all found this helpful. And again, feel free to reach out to me, but I thank you very much for your time and attention. And again, thank you to Seth and the team, Maria, Christine, for helping. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen, and that was a great lot of information for us, especially during a pandemic and all this different ways to claim and different rules that are coming out through FEMA. So a lot of good information, and we thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you to everyone for attending. As a reminder, please complete the survey that will appear at the end of this session once we close out. Also, if you're attending the next session on PPP, you will need to log in using the link for that session that was provided in your confirmation email. We hope to see you all at the next session. Thank you.